Call the meeting to order. Please join me with a salute to our flag. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, and good morning. Roll call, please, Jim.
Mr. Morrow?
Here.
Mr. Harrington?
Here.
Mr. Maryhill?
Here.
Mr. Gardner?
Here.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Fairby?
Here.
Mr. Monty?
Here.
Mr. McNally?
Here.
Mr. Skotsbaba? Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleedy?
Here.
Mr. Moore? Mr. Marnell? Mr. Moore is here. Mr. Whitson?
Here.
Mr. Giordano has been excused. Mr. Tyler?
Here.
Mr. Gilliland has been excused. Mr. Preston?
Here.
Thank you.
Good morning. We have no guests. However, I would like to ask Steve Valley to come forward, please. I'd like to present Steve with a proclamation recognizing September 5th through the 11th as National Suicide Prevention Week. Whereas suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States and the second leading cause of death among younger aged 15 to 24. And whereas the suicide rate in Essex County has been 2 times the rate in New York State during the past 10 years. And whereas suicide has a devastating impact upon families, communities, and businesses. And whereas suicide can be prevented by early recognition and appropriate intervention. And whereas it is important that all citizens and communities learn about the warning signs of suicide and how to connect individuals in crisis with assistance and care. And whereas recognizing Suicide Prevention Week and September as Suicide Prevention Month will increase the knowledge of the factors and that offer protection from suicidal behaviors and promote willingness or wellness and recovery for all citizens of Essex County. Now, therefore, Charles Harrington, as chairman and on behalf of the Human Services Committee, and I, William Fairby, as chairman and on behalf of the Essex County Board of Supervisors, do proclaim the month of September 2016 as Suicide Prevention Month, and the week of September 5th through the 11th of 2016 as Suicide Prevention Week in Essex County. This proclamation is issued this day, the 6th day of September 2016. You all say the word, sir? Yes, please.
Okay, so I'm certain I'm not going to talk too long because I'm wearing the Suicide Coalition fleece. It's a little warm today, so I'm not going to want to stand up here in this thing for too long. But I want to thank Bill and Charlie for sponsoring this proclamation and bringing attention to this very, very serious issue in Essex County and really everywhere. The Suicide Prevention Coalition was founded in 2013, and really with a vision to raise awareness, promote education, and increase action to prevent suicides. The message really is that suicide is preventable, as we heard in the proclamation, that it is more than just a mental health issue, that it is also a community action issue and a public health issue. So again, we've kind of formulated our work around education and awareness of the general public and for providers, people out in the community who may come in contact with folks. And the other point I want to make is that the coalition has really put together a group of trainings and resources that are available to all of your communities and for any organization that is interested. So the way that we do that is, again, primarily through some trainings, and these are public trainings for lay people, but they can be for professionals as well. And there is, in the packet that I handed out, there's a brochure for the coalition, and on the inside page, suicide awareness and prevention training, it lists some of the different trainings that we have. And these, I'm going to name these out. They're not going to mean a whole lot to you, but you can read some brief descriptions. We have Lifelines, which is a school-based program, QPR, Safe Talk, Assist, Mental Health First Aid. We also have a variety of other resources that are available to us, and we can customize a lot of these interventions. So if you're interested in having somebody come to your town board or any group in your town, you can have them call the Mental Health Clinic, 873-3670, or the Mental Health Association, 962-2077. Again, those numbers are on the back of the brochure. Again, all of this is focused around the idea that suicide is preventable. It's a community issue. It's not just a mental health issue, so it's a real public health issue. And we do have the resources that are out there to help folks get informed and take action. I handed out a graph with the suicide rates for New York State and for Essex County from 2006 to 2014. And what you'll see there is that for a good period of time, Essex County, except for 2 years, has had a rate higher than the rest of the state. And at times, in 2011, 2012 in particular, it was more than double the state rate. Maybe actually even pretty close to triple the state rate. But I am happy to say, as you can see here, that in 2013 and 14, we just got this data from DOH last week, that the number of suicides has dropped pretty dramatically, and we've cut our rate in half from around 25 to right around 12 or 12, 13. Don't have the exact numbers there. And I just do want to point out that our coalition started in 2013, and I'm not going to suggest that that's a direct correlation, but I think it's helped. So it's really gratifying for us to see that there are some results that we can point to the work that we've done. To that point, I want to take a moment to acknowledge members of the coalition here. Again, we've been working at this now since 2013, and we've got a consortium of folks. You'll recognize some of the faces from department heads, but also some of the mental health agencies in the county. So if the coalition members would like to stand, I think we basically, you've got the groom side and the bride side, and we're here on this side. So anyway, I'd like to just have a round of applause for the Again, the message is suicide is preventable. It's more than just mental health, it's public health, and it's community education. That's the work that we're doing. And those are the resources that we've amassed and put together that are available. We do have, all the board members have some booklets, packets of information that we've put together that can describe things in more detail. Any of the folks out there in the back, Shelby in the front row here has some of the packets available for folks. If you have any questions, you can give us a call, reach out to us. We're here to help in any way that we can.
Any comment or question for Steve? Not Steve, thank you. Thank you and your coalition Wilson, for all the great work you do.
All right, thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Move into resolution.
Resolution number 225, authorizing appointments to boards, committees, and/or councils.
Moved by Mr. Morrow, second by Mr. Tyler, Mr. Mary. Comments or questions? None, all in favor, aye? Aye. Opposed? Carried. Thank you.
Resolution 226, recognizing the month of September 2016 as Suicide Prevention Month and the week of September 5th through the 11th, 2016 as National Suicide Prevention Week.
By Mr. Monty, Mr. Harrington. Do I have a second? Second. Thank you.
Resolution 227, authorizing the Essex County Office for the Aging to hold a public hearing in the month of October on the proposed 2017-2018 state fiscal year annual update.
Moved by Mr. Monty, second by Mr. Harrington. Comments or questions? None? All in favor, aye? Aye. Opposed? Carried.
Resolution number 228, amending resolution number 251 of September 6, 2011, weights and measures 2011 device fee schedule, amending to include an update to the fee schedule provided by the New York State Weights and Measures Regulation Part 220.3 scale fees.
Moved by Mr. Tyler, second. Second by Mr. Gardner. Comments or questions? Mr. Scott.
Yeah, I know in the past, I had this discussion with Dan before and also Wayne Taylor. The county currently bills for his services to go in and certify scales at transfer stations. And seeing as it's a county system, I don't know why the individual towns are paying for that service. Because literally anybody in Essex County can go in and use our transfer stations, which they do. So it's not a huge amount, but I'm just saying it's something that I could never understand why we're billing back the individual town where that transfer station is located.
It's something we can look at within his budget in order to define whether we do or don't want to charge it. There's a number, obviously, that's associated with the amount that's charged that we'll have to adjust in his budget. So if you can remind me at budget hearing, we'll talk about that specifically.
Thank you.
You have a comment or question? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano has been excused. Mr. Tyler?
Yes.
Mr. Gorland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution number 229, authorizing budget amendments for various departments.
Mr. Costello, second by Mr. Morrow. Comments or questions? None, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler?
Yes.
Mr. DeGorland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 230, authorizing the chairman or county manager to execute a service agreement with Motorola Solutions in the amount of $179,823.36 for the public safety building radio communications system for the term April 1st, 2016 through March 31st, 2017, with funds to come from the radio project.
Moved by Mr. Miga, second by Mr. Moore. Comments or questions? None, roll call vote, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Monty.
Just a quick question. It says this is for a term of 1 year, so does that mean next year we'll need that contract again?
Yeah. That's an annual maintenance cost associated with the oversight of the entire system.
Okay, and the money's coming from the radio project
This year.
this year, so we're gonna have to fund that.
So in 2017 budget, we will have to account for that for the following year. Yeah.
Thank you.
Will we get an annual report of what they actually have to do, what's involved in their inspections, repairs?
Yeah, we can do that. That will be something you'll be able to tell how many times. The problem is, it's one of those situations where, you pay for maintenance to a certain extent, hope you don't have to use it, because frankly, if nothing goes wrong with your 911 system, your radio communications, that would be ideal. But if you don't have it in place, you're putting the public at risk by not being able to respond quickly.
When we actually awarded this contract to Motorola, I remember there was a lot of discussion, because there was another firm that had also submitted a proposal, and in that original proposal, was there anything addressed in regards to ongoing maintenance of the system? I thought that there was for a period of a few years, but I could be wrong on that.
Not that I'm aware of. I know there's always, no matter which company you hired, you would always be looking at maintenance fees that go with the system. And it's from everything from computer systems to communication systems. You essentially have to pay that maintenance agreement in order to assure that you keep it up when you absolutely have to have it.
How do they, when you look at the number,
Actually,
a little bit odd how they come up with,
well, it is
36
It does
cents.
appear to be odd, but you actually can trace that number all the way back to New York State contract.
They break it right down to the cent.
They absolutely do. Every item and every piece has a number associated with it. You can actually track that number by New York State contract number. You can look on there and see that that's what your annual maintenance costs would be associated with whatever component is within the system.
I understand the importance of having this, however, I personally feel that's an outrageous price on a brand-new system. And normally you would think that as the system gets older, this would go up. And I really have grave concerns, that kind of money on a brand-new system. I'll support it because I know that we have to have it, but I would hope going forward we can have some negotiations in regards to that, because I think that's totally outrageous on a brand-new system.
Any further comments or questions? None, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady? Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler?
Yes.
Mr. Gorland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 231, authorizing the Emergency Services Department to purchase a Motorola GTR 8000 spare radio from Wells Communications from New York State Contract PT 67405 in the amount of $14,980 with funds to come from the radio project.
Moved by Mr. Morrow, second by Mr. Miga. Comments or questions? None, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler?
Yes.
Mr. Gorland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 232, authorizing the Essex County Emergency Services Department to apply for and accept a grant from the New York State Division of Homeland Security Public Safety Answering Point for fiscal year 2016-2017 in the amount of $166,000.
By Mr. Woodson, second by Mr. Tyler, Mr. Miga. Comments or questions? None, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler?
Yes.
Mr. Gorland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 233, authorizing the Essex County Purchasing Agent to go to bid for an engineering study to install a 48-volt power supply at the Inger Hill radio site.
Moved by Mr. Gardner, second, Mr. Miga. What's your question?
I'm going to ask you to pass this, but I honestly think I've been talking with Don, I think we can get away without actually doing any engineering study for this. We're going to have to do that, but it would be good if you had it in place if we needed it, but we are going to attempt to get it done without any study.
Further comment, question? Roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Merryle?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler? Mr. Gilliland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution number 234, approving the issuance by the Essex County Capital Resource Corporation of certain tax-exempt qualified 501c3 revenue bonds to finance a project for the Adirondack Medical Center, DBA Adirondack Health, in the town of North Elba, County of Essex, New York.
Moved by Mr. Pleady, second, Mr. Miga. Comment, question? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Merryle?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee? Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 235, authorizing the purchasing agent to award bid in accordance with Resolution number 192 of July 5th, 2016, to Taylor Rental in the amount of $31,000 for 2 digital informational signs.
Moved by Mr. Monty, second by Mr. Moore. Mr. Skozavala.
Yeah, I learned over the weekend, I see that Jim is here, maybe he can, but Donnelly Construction, who has employees that live in Orion, they also sell these. I don't know why they didn't bid, I mean, at a substantial cost, less than what we're paying. But it might be worthwhile looking into that. I mean, substantially less. They do all the safety work for highway projects.
We did go out to bid. This was the low cost that we received under the bids we did.
I know that's the issue, is that we did go over there.
Further comments, questions?
Where's Michael?
I would assume out of,
Further comments, questions?
Curious as to what substantial is.
no, I am too to some extent, but yet,
Well, like $10,000 per sign.
All right, so,
Can we go back up? Can we? Reject it? We can reject it.
curious as to,
well,
Jim, do you have anything you'd like to add to this?
you need the courtesy
To
of
the floor for Jim Dugan? Yep. 12, yes we do. Jim?
Yes. Does it move by Mary Hugh?
I turned that mic
Turn
on.
that back on.
No, you can turn it back on, but I just that.
Seem to be seeing karaoke, so I know you're not.
Yeah, no. Good morning. We don't have to have those in the next month or two, so if you wanted to go back out to bid, you do have the time to do that. We were purchasing these as part of the Lobdell Road FEMA project. New York State DOT required that we get directional signs out 6 months ahead of that project because 73 is such a busy road, or 9 is such a busy road. So if there's actual savings, I'm all for it. I don't know why they didn't bid.
I explained this to the individual that was telling me about it. I said, we've already gone out and bid. Now, real bid that other people have shown their hand, other companies, probably not the right thing to do. So, in the future, maybe we should, we'll get, I hope that they need to get on our bidder list.
Any further comment or question?
Are they on the bidders list?
No. Only if they weren't, they didn't sign off. That's what their responsibility is. I guess we could do some informal checking, because again, my concern is, I hear this a lot. There's times when we will go out to bid for something and somebody will tell us, oh, you could have got it much cheaper. Well, when we actually look at the specs of what they were proposing, it's a lot different than what it is that we bid. So, I guess what I would like to see is the resolution to pass. We'll do some informal checking. If it turns out that we are somehow the same product or the same specs, then maybe we would go back out at that point.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say, because a couple months ago, somebody from my town did bid, and they found out that we got something through bid, and I said, well, it was advertised, and we should have been on the bidders list. And then, if I was this company here, I'd be upset, because like Tom said, I showed my hand of what I was gonna bid. This other one has a leg up on me, because now they know what they gotta be, so I would be for that.
Any further comments or any questions? Mark or Jim?
I think it's important, like Dan and Jerry said, we gotta make sure we're comparing apples to apples. Are we getting the same product? Because it's easier to say I can give you something cheaper and it not be the same thing. Sure, you give it to me cheaper, but it's half the machine.
Any other questions for Jim? Any further questions on the resolution? If not, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution number 236, authorizing the Health and Safety Department to accept an occupational safety and health hazard abatement board grant in the amount of $5,405 for county and town safety training for the period of August 1st, 2016 through July 31st, 2017.
Moved by Mr. Tyler, second by Mr. Monty and Mr. Morrow. Comments or questions? Not, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution number 237, authorizing the hiring of a temporary full-time employee in the Fish Hatchery Department.
Moved by Mr. Moore, second by Mr. Harrington. Comments or questions? Just a question, is this going to be a new person off the street, or is this somebody's going to...
This is somebody who has been filling in on a temporary basis for us. Prior to this, he is willing to work at a full-time basis at this point. We, again, have a long-term employee out on medical leave. One of the individuals down there is just spending way too much time on overtime, so we really need somebody in there to alleviate that.
Mr. Harrington?
This is also a civil service position, am I correct?
That's correct, yeah. Yep.
Any other questions?
But just so you understand, on a temporary basis, the individual is not subject to testing until such time as they become a permanent appointment. At that point, they would become subject to testing.
Any other questions? Not, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution number 238, authorizing the purchasing agent to award RFP to Architectural Engineering Design Associates for architectural services to be paid from budgeted funds, and authorizing the chairman or county manager to execute a contract for the same.
Moved by Mr. Preston. Second. Mr. Morrow. Comments or questions? None, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill? Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally? Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler?
Yes.
Mr. Gorland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries.
Is there any question?
Resolution 239, urging Governor Cuomo to sign into law Public Defense Mandate Relief Act.
Moved by Mr. Tyler.
Take it.
Thank you.
Resolution number 240, authorizing the Essex County Clerk's Office to accept a grant from the New York State Archives Local Government Records Management Improvement Fund in the amount of $22,401 for the imaging of tax rolls, and further authorizing the county chairman or county manager to execute a contract for the same.
Moved by Mr. Tyler, second by Mr. Depot. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington? Mr. Maryhill? Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler?
Yes.
Mr. Gorland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 241, of condolence to the family of Margaret Peg Schneider.
Moved by Mr. Gardner.
Resolution 242, authorizing the New York State Deferred Compensation Plan to offer Roth designated contributions for Essex County employees.
Moved by Mr. Monty, second by Mr. Tyler and Mr. Moore. Comments or questions? Not roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill? Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler?
Yes.
Mr. Gorland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution number 243, authorizing the purchasing agent to go out to RFP to conduct the title searches for foreclosed properties for the tax years 2013 and 2014, with the cost to come from the general fund.
Moved by Mr. Preston, second by Mr. Depot. Comments or questions?
I have comments.
Dan?
Yeah, when we spoke about this at Ways and Means, I had made the suggestion that we bifurcate this 2013 and 2014 this year, expense-wise in 2015 and 16 next year. Mike and I have subsequently spoken about this, and both of us feel it would be more beneficial, more prudent for the county to do 2013, 14, and 15, so that we can get them all out of the way. 15, we'll be able to act on 15 at in October. So by the time we have the searching done, 15 will be ready, and we can get those all done. So I'd like to ask for an amendment that would be for the tax years 13, 14, and 15.
We'll move that. Mr. Skozavala, Mr. Maryhill. Now resolution as amended.
Discussion on the...
All in favor, aye?
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? Carried. Now the resolution as amended. All in favor, aye? Roll call, I'm sorry. Did I have it? Roll call vote as amended.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Hold on.
Is there discussion?
We already did an aye on the amendments, have been amended, so all we need is a roll call. Is there any discussion on the motion as amended?
I'm sorry, Steve?
Yeah, as more information came to light on this, on the whole thing here, we got back on these tax auctions, but in the last 2 years, I think Mr. Manning said we've done 5 auctions. And we have staff that's willing to do this job, and they're doing a good job at it. And all the money we spend for these title searches are going to come out of our net proceeds for this. And I think it's a waste of money when we're going to be up to date within 2 years to go out to an outside source and spend taxpayers' money. If in fact, we weren't catching up on this.
We're not.
We are. If we're doing 5 auctions in 2 years, we will catch up. That's what Mr. Manning said.
Yeah, I just want to clarify that. The reason I said we did 5 auctions is because I felt a little taken aback that I might have been being criticized. When I have the searches, I can turn these babies out, Mike and I can. But the difference here is, we had the searches, took a while, we had them in those 5 auctions. We need them now. So, I mean, my personal opinion is we need 13, 14, and 15. Crank them out, we'll be right on, we'll be right where we need to be.
But this is
the difference.
This is costing us money, and we will get caught up if we keep on plugging the way we are now. We let this 6 or 8 years ago is when this problem started. In the last 2 years, we've made great strides in getting caught up. And like I said, this is coming out of the net proceeds of the auction, which is a taxpayer's money.
Right, but just for clarification, I'm not taking a stance on this, but we're getting caught up year by year. We're still not working on the back end of, we're still going to be 3-4 years behind. We're only getting searches every year, one search, 1 year.
If we're having 2 auctions a year, we're going to be catching up on this. Didn't we have 2 auctions last year? Spring and fall?
No, we had 1 last year.
How about the year before?
Mr. Morrow?
First of all, this isn't costing us anything.
Let's see what...
Because this is going out to RFP to find out how much it would cost us if we accepted the award and awarded the bid. This is the only reason I'm accepting this today and moving it. I want to see what it would cost us to do this. Doesn't mean I'm going to support it next month when it comes forward, once I see what it's going to cost. And when the county clerk has stood up there and said he can do this, I want to know how much the county clerk can save us if he can do it in a timely manner. If he can't do it in a timely manner, I guess we got to get it done. But I want to see what this is going to cost us.
This is not to award.
That's correct. It's not to award.
Anyone else, Tom? The longer these properties sit, believe me, that's costing the taxpayers a lot more money than title searches are going to be. Because we are making everyone whole when these taxes are not being paid. Your town, my town, school districts, fire districts, water districts, to the tune of $6 million a year plus. So we need to get moving on this. In regards to 5 auctions in 2 years, I must have been out of the county because I don't recall.
We did not do 5 auctions, we did 5 years. 5 years.
Okay.
Worth of, we had two or three auctions.
But again, this is RFPs as they stated, and we'll see how the numbers come in and then move from there.
Any further comment or question? Mr. Harrington?
The chances for those property owners who were delinquent in 2015 certainly are better that they get caught up than those years of delinquency of 2013 and 2014. So I do believe that we should not include 2015 because of the increased percentages of those property owners making themselves well.
That would be amendment 4, 13 and 14.
We already approved that.
Yeah, the amendment's already done that.
Yeah, that's
I realize that.
Further comments or questions?
I just think you need to do this. You need to get caught up 13, 14, and 15, and I guarantee you, this discussion alone will generate people paying their taxes. If the public knows the board is serious about getting to these properties, it always generates payment. That's how it works. So the amount of properties that you're looking at today will look different a month from now if you pass this resolution, because the public is pretty astute about this. They understand when it is that the board is going to take action and when they're going to have an auction, and that prompts them to pay their taxes. So the amount of properties that you're looking at now will shrink. The cost that you will be looking at to get caught up will shrink. And then once you are caught up and the county clerk's office, and this is not a reflection on them, the county clerk's office then can start 16, and we will be in the right frame to get ourselves caught up overall.
Mr. Bonnie?
I agree 100% with what Dan said, and our continued inaction is costing us money. And those properties are decreasing in value because those people that aren't paying their taxes aren't taking care of their property. So they're never going to be worth more than they are today. And so I think it's something we need to do, and like Mr. Morrow said, it doesn't cost us anything to go out and get this bid. At least then we'll know what we're looking at. But I think it's definitely time that we get this done.
Roll call vote. Oh, sorry, Mr. Morris.
As you know, I've been opposed to this from the get-go, but I've always said that I would support going ahead with an RFP to see what the cost is. But I think equally important is that we develop a long-range plan that doesn't let this sort of drop out of sight. I think it was the Board of Supervisors at the time that let this slip. We're the captain of the ship, so to speak, and that's where the hammer falls when we have an error. So I really think whether it's 1 year or every 2 years or whatever the case might be, we need to develop a long-range plan so we don't fall this far behind again.
Roll call vote.
This is the resolution as amended. Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
The resolution carries. Resolution number 244, authorizing the purchasing agent to award bid to Burke Excavation in the amount of $48,390 for asbestos abatement and building demolition at the Essex County Fish Hatchery from budgeted funds.
Moved by Mr. Harrington, second by Mr. Miga. Comments or questions? None, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee? Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala? Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland is excused. Mr. Preston?
No.
Resolution carries. Resolution number 245, authorizing a contract with National Council for Behavioral Health and MTM Services as sole providers for collaborated documentation training in the Essex County Mental Health Department in the amount of $8,000 plus travel cost for on-site training from budgeted funds.
Moved by Mr. Merrick, second. Mr. Monty, comments or questions? Mr. Merrick.
Just curious, on the travel costs, is that for the provider or is that for us? That's for the provider to come up, stay overnight, whatever it takes for the training period. Okay. I expect it to be incidental, but it is a charge.
Had to be said. Thank you. Comments or questions? None, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
The resolution carries. Resolution number 246, authorizing the Public Health Department to apply for and accept a grant from the National Association of County and City Health Officials in the amount of $14,000 and authorizing the chairman or county manager to execute the same.
Moved by Mr. Harrington, second. Mr. Merrick. Comments or questions? If none, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler? Mr. Gilliland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
The resolution carries. Resolution 247, authorizing the Public Health Department to apply for and accept a 3-year grant from Linking Interventions for total population health in the amount of, the total amount of $500,000, and authorizing the chairman or county manager to execute the same.
Moved by Mr. Scozzafava, second, Mr. Morrow. Comments or questions? None, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler?
Yes.
Mr. Goyland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
The resolution carries. Resolution 248, authorizing the Essex County Purchasing Agent to go to bid and award for a Porticount Pro Model 8038 or comparable N95 mask fitting machine for the Public Health Department in an amount not to exceed $16,000 from budgeted funds.
Mr. Tyler, second by Mr. Gardner. Comments or questions? Mr. Monty.
Could you just refresh my memory on that?
Yeah, this is actually a device that measures whether or not the N95 masks are properly fitting and whether there's a
For like
seal
fit
or
testing, okay.
Yeah, to make sure that when our public health nurses or whatever show up at an incident, that their masks are doing the job it's supposed to.
Thank you.
Question? Yes. Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler?
Yes.
Mr. Goyland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
The resolution carries. Resolution 249, authorizing the purchase of a Kanika Minolta BizHub C368 multifunction printer in the Essex County Sheriff's Department in the amount of $6,445.85 from budgeted funds.
Moved by Mr. Morrow, second by Mr. Tyler. Mr. Moore. Comments or questions? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill? Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler?
Yes.
Mr. Goyland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
The resolution carries. Resolution 250, authorizing the Transportation Department to apply for and accept a New York State Department of Transportation Accelerated Transit Capital Funding Grant in the amount of $41,234.
Mr. Tyler, second by Mr. Miga. Mr. Mary. Comments or questions? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler?
Yes.
Mr. Goyland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
The resolution carries. Resolution 251, authorizing the purchasing agent to RFP for materials to build a pole barn in the Transportation Department to house the Essex County buses.
Moved by Mr. Monty, second, Mr. Tyler. Comments or questions? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Monty?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler?
Yes.
Mr. Goyland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
The resolution carries.
Resolution from the floor. Judy, you have one other?
We do have one resolution from the floor. I have made copies for your desks, and it's regarding the public hearing we had this morning, authorizing the submission of the community development block grant applications.
Moved by,
I need 12.
12 allowed on the floor.
Yes, you do.
Moved by Mr. Morrow, second by Mr. Monti. Comments or questions?
That needs a roll call.
All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried.
Why don't you do a roll call just in case?
Roll call vote just in case.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill? Mr. Gardner? Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee? Mr. Monti?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady? Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler? Mr. Gilliland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
The resolution carries.
Mr. Moore.
I'd like to have permission to move a resolution from the floor authorizing the Essex County Department of Public Works to apply and to accept grants from the New York Bridge Program up to $10.4 million. And if I can get it on the floor, I'll explain where it is.
12 allowed on the floor.
Yes, you do.
Second for discussion.
The four bridges are the Campsite Road in the town of Newcomb, the Moncalm Street in the town of Ticonderoga, Moose Pond Road in the town of San Armin, Tahaz Road in the town of Newcomb. Then besides those four bridges, there's four culverts also. On the Wells Hill Road in the town of Lewis, there's three culverts that weren't replaced during the Hurricane Irene. There was no funding for them at that time. And then also the Hurricane Mountain Road in the town of Keene. So those are the 4 and 4.
What's the resolution again, Jerry?
I can give you a copy of it.
Yeah, but what is it, just for my...
It's a resolution to allow the county to apply and accept grants from the Bridge New York program.
Okay.
For $10.4 million.
Yeah, go for it.
Any other comments or questions? Not roll call vote, please.
Who seconded it?
Mr. Preston?
Okay.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill? Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Monti?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Miga?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell is absent. Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Giordano is excused. Mr. Tyler?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland is excused. Mr. Preston?
Yes.
The resolution carries.
Any further resolutions? Mr. Monti.
I'd like to offer a resolution of appreciation for Lenita Canavan for 30 years of service to Essex County as of the 29th of August. She's been a town of Lewis resident as well as a town of Lewis council person, and I'd offer that resolution of appreciation.
12 allowed on the floor.
Yes, you do.
Second.
Second.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any further?
Not a resolution, but I have. I received this morning when I got to work here a letter in regards to a county employee filing a grievance against me.
Okay. We should go into executive...
I don't have, if you want to go into, I have no reason not to discuss this on the floor.
But
If
probably
you want
not-
to go into executive session, that's fine with me.
Okay.
But I've got nothing here that I need to hide.
Right. I understand that, but it's just oftentimes prudent when we're dealing with matters of employment and things of that nature to go into executive sessions in case something is inadvertently said that might pose a problem.
Who decides if this has any merit?
Let's make a motion to go into
Well,
executive...
I'm not going to discuss any names or anything else. I just got some general questions in regards to what was in my box this morning.
There's a process under
15C.
County Law, Article 15C, I think it's Section 684,
84, I think.
2 or 4, for the filing of grievance by certain individuals. There's a two-step process, basically. The grievance first goes to that person's superior or the department head for consideration, and then that superior evaluates the situation and makes suggestions to how to alleviate it and how to remedy it. If that's not acceptable, then the grievant may ask for a public hearing on the matter to present the grievance. There's a hearing had, and then there's a determination made
Now,
under the statute.
and just doing a quick review on this, and,
But I don't want to really get into it, Tom.
well, I just want to make a couple, because I've seen this movie before.
Right.
Okay? Under county law, if you look under powers and duties of a member of the Board of Supervisors, they absolutely have the right to investigate any department, any employee. That's part of our powers and duties.
I don't disagree with that.
And if you look at the whistleblower law,
I don't disagree with that.
someone can send a letter, be it signed or anonymous.
Right.
And it's our responsibility as the Board of Supervisors of this county to look into it.
Right.
Now, I'm going to file insubordination charges against this individual for what he has stated in his letter towards me. So, if we want to get in the ring on this thing, let's go. Because all I did was read a letter that I had received.
I would make the comment that reading letters like that in an open forum is not, in my impression, going to help the county and not proper. We should do those things in executive session. I'm not saying,
You were here when I read the letter, you didn't say that.
I mean, when the letter's read, I don't have much time to say anything.
Well, nobody stopped me.
Well, it was a one-paragraph letter, and you blurted it out. What was I going to do?
I know, I heard you blurt out things before.
No, and I'm not picking on you. Tom, just for everybody's edification, those things are very temperamental. When you start making allegations, even if they're true, in an open forum,
Let's stay on that one.
until we've
word.
investigated it, you gotta be careful.
Read the minutes. I never made an allegation.
I know you didn't.
I simply read a letter and then questioned
I didn't say you did it.
the mayor of the letter.
Right. But I'm just saying, in the future, the more prudent practice is to get into executive session and discuss it. And I'm not trying to...
Anything else?
protect the county.
Anything else? One other announcement. I put together an occupancy tax committee back when we were discussing the vacation rental occupancy tax issue. I would like to dismantle that committee as of October 1st, 17 or 16. There's no need for that committee anymore, right? So anyone that was on that committee, I'll have Judy send out a memo to the members of that committee. Anything further to come before this? Are you going to go in executive session?
Dan's explained to me what the procedure is at this point. There's no need, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, good. We're seeing adjourned. Thank you.